Hello, my friends. The Western narrative about Ukraine is collapsing under its own contradictions, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the private conversations of the very people who sold this war as a moral crusade. A recent transcript obtained by Der Spiegel lays bare just how frightened Europe's political class has become. In a closed-door conference call, German Chancellor Scholz, France's Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, Donald Tusk, Meloni, Stoltenberg, and a roster of other European cool kids spoke bluntly about one thing: their fear that Donald Trump's negotiations with Russia will leave them on the sidelines and expose the reality they've spent years denying, that Russia is winning, and they have almost no leverage left. In that call, they weren't talking about Ukrainian sovereignty in any meaningful sense. They were talking about how to protect Zelensky, how not to leave Ukraine and Zelensky alone with these guys, meaning Russian negotiators backed by a United States that may no longer be willing to mortgage its future on an unwinnable proxy war. The tone was not confident. It was anxious, defensive, and deeply insecure. These leaders are not worried that Ukraine might lose. They are worried that the world will finally see they bet everything on a losing hand. What truly terrifies them is that Washington and Moscow are now dealing with each other directly. Trump's envoys went to Moscow carrying a detailed 28-point peace plan, along with 4 supporting documents. Putin later explained that the meeting took 5 hours because the Russian side went through each point carefully, line by line, evaluating the proposal. That is how serious negotiation is conducted: methodically, face to face, between real power centers. By contrast, Ukraine's delegation flew to Florida to plead its case on American soil, while the Europeans huddled on conference calls, complaining that Trump might throw Zelensky under the bus and cut a deal that acknowledges the battlefield facts. Those facts are simple. Russia holds the initiative and the strategic depth. Ukrainian manpower is depleted, its infrastructure shattered, its economy gutted. No amount of media spin can hide the trajectory. The longer this war continues, the worse it becomes for Ukraine. The Europeans know this, which is why they are clinging desperately to the only card they think they still hold: the frozen Russian state assets seized under sanctions. Ursula von der Leyen dresses this theft up with a euphemism, calling it a reparations loan. Privately, European diplomats call it what it is: reckless and insane. The scheme is straightforward. Approximately 210 billion in Russian assets have been frozen. On paper, that money will sustain Ukraine for 2 years. Scratch the surface and the ugliness shows. Around 40 billion immediately goes to repay a prior G7 loan to Kyiv, money already spent. Another large chunk is earmarked as a gift to the Western military-industrial complex to replenish weapons and keep the war machine humming. Only the remainder flows to Zelensky's government to prevent total collapse. Anyone with basic arithmetic can see the problem. At current burn rates, this money buys at best 6 months of breathing room, not 2 years. And when it runs out, Brussels will come begging for more, still pretending this is about helping Ukraine rather than propping up its own crumbling prestige. For figures like Scholz and von der Leyen, the frozen assets are more than cash. They are the last illusion of leverage. They believe that by holding this money hostage, they can force their way into any eventual settlement and secure a seat at the table between Washington and Moscow. But from Russia's perspective, this theft only confirms what the Kremlin has said for years. The West cannot be trusted with financial obligations and is willing to weaponize the global monetary system for political blackmail. In trying to pressure Russia, Europe has instead accelerated the world's move away from Western-controlled financial infrastructure. That is strategic self-harm masquerading as statecraft. The desperation in Europe is mirrored by the frantic activity in London. The UK establishment, humiliated by its own failure to produce victory in Ukraine, has decided to resurrect an old and tired play: Russiagate plus Novichok. A new public inquiry into the 2018 Salisbury poisoning has concluded, predictably, that Putin must have given the order. The Skripals themselves did not testify. Their current whereabouts remain opaque. Yet British authorities stitched together the chemical agent, Russian intelligence, and the old allegations about hacking Hillary Clinton's emails into one narrative. The intended message to Trump is unsubtle. If you continue negotiating seriously with Russia, we will turn the dial back to full Russiagate hysteria. This isn't intelligence work. It is political extortion dressed up as forensics. The UK is not trying to uncover truth. It is trying to keep alive a narrative architecture that has already collapsed under scrutiny. By linking alleged GRU operatives, Novichok, and the Clinton email saga, London is trying to reestablish Putin equals Trump equals evil, just as Trump's team sits down with Moscow to discuss peace. The timing isn't coincidental. It is tactical, and it reeks of panic. Meanwhile, look at what Russia is actually doing. Putin travels to India and is personally greeted at the airport by Prime Minister Modi, a protocol exception made only for the most important partners. They hold formal talks advancing a relationship that stretches across energy, defense, and technology. While Western media howls that Russia is isolated, India treats Moscow as a central strategic partner. Russia hosts American negotiators in its own capital. Ukraine begs for attention in Florida. Europe leaks transcripts from panicked conference calls, if this is isolation. It's a strange kind, the kind where the supposed outcast quietly builds a multipolar order while his enemies burn their own credibility. Inside the European Union, the rot is not confined to foreign policy. A string of corruption scandals reveals a structure more interested in self-enrichment and ideological posing than governance. Former top EU diplomat Federica Mogherini faces charges. Senior officials tied to prestigious institutions like the College of Europe are implicated in schemes that flourished under the tenure of people such as Josep Borrell. Estonia's Kaja Kallas, in charge of EU transparency, now scrambles to distance her office from the scandal, insisting that the machinery she supposedly oversees bears no responsibility for the corruption it failed to prevent. It is classic Brussels behavior. Moralizing in public, looting in private, denying accountability when caught. Even Europe's soft power projects have become symbols of hypocrisy. The Eurovision Song Contest, once marketed as harmless cultural fun, is now openly political. Russia remains banned for geopolitical reasons, but Israel is allowed to compete despite a war in Gaza that has horrified large segments of the European public. In response, 4 countries, Ireland, Spain, Slovenia, and the Netherlands, threatened to withdraw from the 2026 competition. The organization insists it should not be politicized over Israel, conveniently forgetting it had no problem politicizing Eurovision to exclude Russia. The double standard mirrors exactly what we saw with the International Criminal Court. Celebrated for targeting Putin, attacked and sanctioned when it turned its gaze on Israeli leadership. Add to this the absurd spectacle of the former owner of a major pornography conglomerate, now positioning himself as a potential buyer of Russian energy assets in Eastern Europe, previously held by Lukoil before sanctions forced divestment. Western policy has created a situation where serious strategic energy infrastructure in countries like Bulgaria and Romania might effectively pass from Russian hands into those of a man whose fortune comes from exploiting human vice on a global scale. From Russian energy to porn energy, that is what European values have delivered. It would be comical if it weren't so revealing. All of these threads, intelligence, theatrics, asset theft, media hypocrisy, cultural decay, and elite corruption intersect in Ukraine. The war has become a mirror reflecting back the true condition of Western power. European leaders are not confident architects of a rules-based order. They are frightened managers of a failing narrative. They say Ukraine is a sovereign partner, but treat it as a pawn, a talking point, a budget line. They claim Russia is isolated while flying halfway around the world to court India, Africa, and Latin America, all of whom are quietly deepening their ties with Moscow and Beijing. They accuse Russia of weaponizing everything, then openly weaponize finance, law, culture, and information themselves. The shift is simple and profound. Russia now shapes outcomes. Not Brussels, not London, not Kyiv. Washington, at least under a Trump administration, appears ready to acknowledge that any sustainable solution in Europe runs through Moscow, not around it. That is why Trump's emissaries sat for 5 hours in Moscow going through a detailed peace plan with Russian officials, while Europe clung to leaked transcripts and frozen assets as if they were lifeboats in a storm. The tragedy is that Ukraine could have avoided this catastrophe had Western leaders recognized Russia's red lines years ago and accepted the reality of a multipolar world. Instead, they chose escalation, fantasy, and propaganda. They turned Ukraine into a battlefield for ambitions it could never satisfy, and now they are terrified of being locked out of the very negotiations that will finally end the war they helped prolong. In the end, the only real question left for the collective West is not whether it will back down, but how humiliating that retreat will be. The choices are narrowing. They can continue to pretend that press releases and frozen accounts equal power, or they can accept what the battlefield, global diplomacy, and even their own leaked calls already make clear. Russia has endured, adapted, and advanced, while their own systems crack under the strain of lies they can no longer sustain. The latest revelations from within Europe expose a deep and growing panic among Western elites as they confront a reality they long denied. Russia is winning the strategic contest over Ukraine, and negotiations are now shifting decisively away from Brussels and toward Moscow. A leaked transcript published by Der Spiegel has confirmed what many suspected. Europe fears that Donald Trump may negotiate directly with Russia and cut the EU out of the process entirely. European leaders on the call, Germany's Merz, France's Macron, Italy's Meloni, NATO's Secretary General, Ursula von der Leyen, and others explicitly acknowledged their terror at being sidelined, and more importantly, the danger they believe. Their obsession centers on two issues: Trump's willingness to strike a deal that recognizes the battlefield reality of Russian advances and the billions in frozen Russian assets they are hoarding as their last desperate bargaining chip. Europe has effectively admitted in this transcript that without those Russian assets, they have no power, no leverage, and no seat at the table in any settlement. They believe that forcing Russia to accept the theft of those assets is the only way to keep themselves relevant. Yet, even within the bloc, resistance is growing. Belgium has refused to yield to German and EU Commission pressure to release the funds, knowing full well that surrendering would destroy what Europe calls the reparations loan is nothing more than an illegal seizure designed to keep Kyiv's collapsing government alive for a few more months and to funnel money into the military-industrial complex. They talk of 2 years of support. In reality, it would be burned up in less than 6 months. The panic is visible. Merz rushed to Brussels, abandoning his planned trip to Oslo in a desperate attempt to bring the Belgian government into line. Meanwhile, von der Leyen and Merz, who do not even like each other, are pretending unity because they knew net. Behind all of this is fear of Russia's recent diplomatic strength. Vladimir Putin's meeting in Moscow with senior U.S. envoys lasted 5 hours because Washington brought a detailed peace plan, 27 or 28 points, plus 4 accompanying documents, which Russia examined point by point. That alone exposes the absurdity of the Western narrative that Russia is isolated. The Americans flew to Moscow, Ukraine flew to Florida. Washington deals with Russia directly because Russia is the decisive actor. Europe knows it and hates it, and that is why European leaders are now whispering that Trump cannot be trusted. They are terrified that he will recognize Russia's irreversible control over territory like Donbass, something Putin has already stated will be achieved either by negotiations or by force. Every day the West refuses reality as another day, Ukrainians die for nothing. The leaked transcript shows European leaders begging each other to protect Zelensky, not from Russia, but from their own supposed American allies. Their message is clear. Trump might betray Ukraine by making peace. Trump might end the war that Brussels needs to continue. Trump might expose that their entire Ukraine project has failed. Thus, we see the resurrection yet again of the tired Russiagate narratives. The UK is once more building propaganda structures to tie Trump to Putin, preparing blackmail mechanisms to pressure the future White House away from compromise. They fear not Russian aggression, but Russian diplomacy. Because the truth is simple. Russia holds the upper hand militarily, politically, economically, and diplomatically. The battlefield is lost for Ukraine. Its human reserves are depleted. Its economy is a carcass held upright only by Western cash. Its president is treated like a fragile mascot by his own sponsors. And Europe, once boasting of unity, is splintering under the pressure of reality. This is why hysteria is now consuming EU leadership. Their project failed. Their influence is collapsing. Their power is slipping into irrelevance. Russia did not merely resist the West. Russia outmaneuvered it. What remains now is not a question of if the war ends in Russia's favor, but how quickly the West accepts it and how much more Ukrainian blood will be sacrificed before that acceptance becomes unavoidable. The past days have exposed a remarkable transformation in the global strategic landscape. While Western elites continue to manufacture illusions, the geopolitical ground beneath them has shifted decisively in favor of Russia. Every move they make now betrays their own insecurity, their panic, and ultimately their defeat. The leaked European phone call published by Der Spiegel should be understood not as gossip but as evidence of collapse. Europe's most powerful leaders, Macron, Merz, von der Leyen, Tusk, Meloni, gathered in fear to discuss the most terrifying possibility. Donald Trump might actually negotiate peace with Russia. The thought alone sends shockwaves through Brussels. They know what peace means, the recognition that Russia has prevailed. They anxiously warned each other that Zelensky must not be left alone with these guys, meaning the United States. Their fear is not Russian tanks, but American diplomacy. They are terrified that the war they engineered to break Russia is instead breaking Europe. They see clearly what the battlefield already proved. Russia dictates the terms. Ukraine, bled out and bankrupt, is only a pawn kept alive by Western propaganda and cash injections. And Europe's last bargaining chip, their trump card, is the looting of Russian frozen assets. That is the only thing that gives Brussels any illusion of relevance. Without those funds, they are spectators, not participants. The frantic midnight maneuvers of German officials traveling to Brussels to pressure Belgium illustrate a desperate empire clinging to its last lever. They call this theft a reparations loan, as if linguistic acrobatics can hide the illegality of modern-day piracy. At the same moment, their Russia's isolated narrative completely collapsed. While European leaders huddle in panic, India rolls out a red carpet for President Putin, with Prime Minister Modi personally greeting him at the airport, a gesture reserved only for the most respected partners. And in Moscow, U.S. negotiators spent 5 hours presenting a detailed multi-document peace proposal directly to Russian officials. The Americans fly to Russia, the Ukrainians fly to Florida. Isolation? Hardly. The West sees it. They feel it. And out of fear, they resurrect the same exhausted propaganda machine. The UK has launched yet another Russiagate storyline, linking Novichok 2016 emails and Putin in a narrative so sloppy it screams political coercion. It is a warning shot. If Trump dares pursue real peace with Russia, the smear apparatus will be reactivated at full power. Europe's hypocrisy extends far beyond intelligence manipulation. Even cultural arenas have become battlegrounds for double standards. Eurovision, supposedly a harmless song contest, bans Russia entirely while insisting Israel must be included. Several nations now threaten to withdraw in protest, exposing a system rotted by geopolitical bias. Just like the ICC, which tried to weaponize legal institutions against Putin while shielding NATO allies, until the situation in Gaza exposed their contradictions so brutally that the entire house of cards began to tremble. As cracks widen inside the EU, corruption scandals engulf the elite. Institutions supposedly tasked with transparency are themselves implicated in bribery and influence peddling. The very bureaucrats who scream the loudest about European values are caught selling those values to the highest bidder. And still they dare to lecture the world about integrity. Perhaps the most revealing story of decay is this. As Russia is forced to divest energy infrastructure in Europe due to sanctions, the bidders now lining up include the former billionaire owner of a global adult website empire. That is who Europe wants, controlling its ethical energy future. A porn tycoon, buying up Russia's assets with Washington's blessing. A perfect metaphor for a continent that traded dignity for ideology. While Europe fractures, the United States dithers, and Ukraine collapses, Russia advances its national interest with structural confidence. Putin has declared the control of Donbass will be secured peacefully if possible, militarily if required, and nothing indicates Russia will need to compromise. Reality has shifted and everyone knows it. This war no longer revolves around Ukraine's fate. Ukraine's fate was sealed 2 years ago. The real struggle now is whether the West can tolerate the consequences of its own failure. Every day the Europeans delay a settlement is another day they deepen their humiliation and extend the suffering of Ukrainians they claim to defend. Russia has already shaped the outcome. The only question left is whether the West will accept peace like adults or be dragged into it, shivering, screaming, and lying all the way. One thing remains certain. History is no longer moving in the direction the West demands. It is moving in the direction Russia has earned.